Okay, guys, I'm gonna get started for today. Um, so, in our previous lectures, we've gotten a pretty good understanding of how Bitcoin works at a high level and also at a low level. So today, we'll take all our knowledge that we've learned so far and learn how to destroy Bitcoin. Okay? We'll be looking into attacks and other malicious behavior that can potentially destroy Bitcoin, and we'll analyze them from a kind of a game theory kind of perspective. Um, One thing to note, we've been talking about Bitcoin so far, um, but hopefully you've been getting a basic understanding of how cryptocurrencies and blockchains in general work. This lecture actually marks our very last lecture where we talk about like cryptocurrencies in general, and we'll start to talk more about high-level topics like scaling and privacy in further upcoming lectures. And so another thing to note for this lecture is that we talk about Bitcoin for these attacks, but really all the attacks that I mentioned today really work on any proof of work blockchain that you can find out in the wild. And so, oh yes, we have a new public Discord channel. Feel free to join and ask questions. We'll be using this not necessarily in this class, but like our general community can come here to engage with like the blockchain network members, and also maybe the fundamentals teams will also be here to talk. Yeah. So a quick overview of what we'll be covering today. So I'll start talking about mining pool strategies, forking and double spending, specifically double spending in the context of at a blockchain level, and then we'll talk about censorship. And then Jillian will take over and talk about selfish mining, and she'll cover a few defenses for these types of attacks in like a interactive discussion setting. Okay. So let's talk a little bit about mining pool strategies. We talked a little bit about how miners or these rational individuals are really driven by profit. So for example, if you don't have specialized mining equipment, you might not try to solo mine yourself because it's not feasible. So you might join a mining pool in order to get more frequent returns. And then in this section, we'll look into how you can actually use particular strategies to increase your profits even further. So a bit of review, we talked about two different types of payout schemes last time. We talked about pay per share. So in pay per share, this scheme pays out a fixed amount for each share, or this share really means it's a near valid block. This payment is guaranteed as long as this miner continues to produce these shares. So as long as someone's churning away and doing work, they'll get paid. But the idea is that there's no incentive for this miner to actually submit like valid blocks. He can just basically do useless work and just continue getting paid for it, and that's one downside to this payout scheme. Proportional payout schemes pays out when a block is found, and depending on how many blocks were submitted before this valid block was found, miners get paid some proportion of that reward. But the key factor is if your mining pool doesn't find a valid block, that miners won't get paid for their work. And so there's clear differences in schemes, there's clear differences in these two schemes. And so my question is it possible that mining pools are vulnerable to some sort of incentive or misalignment? Like, can miners take advantage of the differences in these two types of payout schemes to increase their profit? Just a thing to note. And so the idea is, yes, we can actually do that. Remember, miners really want to maximize their payout, and whatever they can do, so what can they do to take advantage of this particular fact? We use this strategy called pool hopping. So on this graph on the right, you can see that this is a graph representing the difference in payouts over time, or over the number of blocks that were submitted to the mining pool, between a pay per share and a proportional model. So the red is proportional, and the pay per share is on the blue line. So in a proportional pool, the faster we find a valid block, so the fewer shares it takes to find a valid block, the more a miner will get paid. But the more work or shares that are submitted to this mining pool, the payout kind of diminishes and approaches like zero. So let's take a look at pay per share. So we remember that pay per share pays a fixed amount every time a share is submitted. And so what if we were to utilize these two particular facts and we make a strategy out of it? So let's say we join a proportional pool at first with hopes of making like really big gains at the beginning. Like if we get lucky and this mining pool ends up finding a valid block, you get paid a huge like payout. But over time, as it becomes less and less profitable, you might consider changing pools or switching to this pay per share pool where your payouts are constant and you know that your payouts won't diminish over time. And so that's the exact idea of what pool hopping is. We start in a proportional pool, and once it becomes less profitable, we switch. And so, but what do we notice from this actually? Honest and loyal miners are really cheated out of their profit by irrational miners who are trying to maximize their own profit. And because of this, proportional pools are really not feasible in practice. And so one of the biggest problems in mining pools is designing a pool strategy where the incentives between these two different pools, or these designing incentives for the pools to encourage like loyalty, but also valid work. And so if we look back, proportional mining pools really incentivizes valid work because you don't get paid out unless the pool finds a block. But it doesn't incentivize miner loyalty. And pay per share is the exact opposite of that. It doesn't incentivize valid work, but it does maintain this like miner loyalty kind of aspect. And so knowing this, knowing that we have like more pay per share models out in the world of mining pools, it leads to another attack vector. We have this idea of pool cannibalization. Okay? Miners can still get paid if they don't submit valid blocks in a pay per share model because you're getting paid a constant or fixed amount per share. So in this attack, we can consume parts of other pools through pool cannibalization. The idea is to distribute some of our own mining power into other pay per share pools, and by doing so, we in those other pools that we distribute our mining power in, we don't want to submit any valid blocks. So the idea is we're effectively reaping in the payouts from working in these other pools, but we're not increasing their revenue in any way or benefiting them in any way. So that's the idea. And so let's use an example to show why this might be the case. So let's have like a really general example of, let's say our total network has 100, the total computing power in the network is 100 hashes per second. And let's say we have 30 ASICs, so we have 30 hashes per second. We have a total computing power of 30 hashes per second. And we assume that, let's say, for like simplicity's sake, that the block reward is 1 Bitcoin, right? So given that we have around 30% of the hash rate in the entire network, our expected mining reward from mining a block is around 0.3 Bitcoin. This is just expected value. This doesn't mean it's like accurate in any way. But let's say we buy more mining equipment. We buy another ASIC that gives us one more hash per second. And so how do we want to distribute our mining power? So the standard strategy is to take this new ASIC and just add it to our own mining pool. And so the idea is if we add 1% of this one ASIC into our mining pool, we now have 30.69% of the hash rate in the network. And so our expected value or expected revenue gain from this one additional ASIC is like 0.0069 Bitcoin. Okay, so that's the standard strategy, the honest strategy. But let's take a look at the pool cannibalization strategy. So rather than taking our one ASIC and putting it into our mining pool, we take our one ASIC and distribute its computing power across the rest of the network. And so effectively what we're doing is in the other pay per share pools, we have 70 parts out of 71 that are honest, and our 1 out of 71 is dishonest. So effectively, the mining pools that have no idea that this is going on, they have an effective hash rate of around 70%, and so their effective payout or expected value for mining is like 0.7 Bitcoin, right? And so we have um, this like stake in these other mining pools, and we'll get paid out continuously for doing malicious work, basically. And so we have one part of the 71 times the expected value of the profits that they'll gain, and we actually gain a little bit more than what we would do in the standard strategy. So we get a revenue gain of 0.0098 Bitcoin. And so this is a really, really scary realization that we have in this honest versus malicious setting. It's more profitable to actually cheat, and cannibalize in other pools. And so this is a scary realization, but that's not all. So we can use this deduction from just this example, and we can kind of look at what we can have in the entire network. Like we can have pool wars, right? So let's think about this in terms of, we have, let's say, two pools, two parties, and they're deciding whether or not they can attack or not attack the other pool, right? So we can model this like a iterative game, and we notice that in each iteration we have this idea of the prisoner's dilemma. So what I mean by that is, so we have, if we look at this from pool one's perspective, we have two different choices we can make. We can either attack the other pool or not attack. So in the case of both pools not attacking each other, they get their normal payouts, their expected payouts, without having to screw over any one or the other. But if pool one attacks pool two, they increase their own profits at the expense of the other, and likewise for pool two to do to pool one. And if they both attack each other at the same time, everyone ends up in a worse position. Make any sense? So yeah, that's what it kind of looks like. We realize that attacking is now the dominant strategy, because if we don't there's nothing stopping the other miner or the other pool from attacking the other pool, and we have this cycle of we should always attack. But if both of them attack each other, both will earn less than they would have if neither of them attacked. So we end up with this really sucky situation where in the long run, both pools, they can't agree to not attack each other. They can either break this rule or cheat the other pool and go against one another, and increase their profits at the expense of the other. So in this idea, in this setting, we have this idea of the tragedy of the commons. Everyone is worse off in this situation. The entire network is worse off in this situation because there's no other strategy except to attack other pools in the network. Yeah.
So I agree in the first, if you're running this game once,
Mm-hmm.
then clearly you're best off attacking and dominates, like in the prisoner's dilemma.
Mm-hmm.
But when they run competitions of machines on how you play infinite or
Mm-hmm.
billion iterated version of the prisoner's dilemma, the optimal strategy is don't attack and then copy.
Mm-hmm.
So why wouldn't that apply here, where you run the first few blocks, you're not being attacked, you continue to copy, and thus you agree to cooperate until you get attacked, essentially.
So I guess in that situation, if you have a binding sort of agreement that you won't attack the other pools and other pools won't attack you, it might be better off to actually just not attack at all. But there's nothing kind of stopping the other pools from acting in a good way, I think. Yeah.
You can detect when you're attacked.
Yeah. Not really. You can't actually detect this happening. It's really difficult to detect. So, and that's one last point that I didn't cover. It was pools can't really detect this happening because it happens at either a small scale or like in Bitcoin, it's like you don't know who's attacking who and which miners are part of which mining pool too. So there's a gray area about who's attacking who and if they're being attacked or not. And so that does contribute to the idea of the idea that we don't know if we're being attacked or not, and so therefore we might as well just attack too. Any other questions? So this is all the mining pool strategies. We'll start talking about forking and double spending. So we talked about double spending in the very first lecture and how at a protocol level, Bitcoin kind of prevents against that. So at a blockchain level, it might be a little bit more feasible. So let's take a step back and review what is a double spend. So it's basically spending the same value more than once. And so let's have a scenario. Let's say it's the year 2099 and Gloria sees that the iPhone 92 something has been leaked and she wants to get her hands on it. And it looks like I have a phone, the phone that she wants, and then she offers to buy it from me for 100 Bitcoin. But secretly, she doesn't want to give up her Bitcoins because why not? Hashtag follow, right? So how can Gloria really double spend on blind? So this really, this scenario, at a naive situation, let's say I am a naive user in the Bitcoin network and I only check if a transaction is valid. What I mean by that is whether or not she has the ownership of like the 100 Bitcoins, and she also has a total of 100 Bitcoins too. So I only check those two things, and I don't check anything else. This is in a very naive situation, and I'm susceptible to a race attack. So the situation goes like this. So Gloria sends me a transaction from her to me of 100 Bitcoins, and once I see that, I send her the iPhone. But secretly, she tells the rest of the network that she's sending 100 Bitcoins to another address. And so everyone in the network sees that, oh, she's sending Bitcoin to this other address. And so once the whole blockchain comes to consensus and I find out that, oh no, my transaction didn't go through, I can't go complain to the network and say, wait, but I got this transaction. Everyone's history kind of is different, right? And so that's at a very naive situation if I only check for just a valid transaction and nothing else. So that's where we introduce the idea of confirmations. So confirmations at a very simple level isn't really confirming anything about the transaction. It's just whether or not, or the number of blocks that have been added to a particular block that I'm looking at. Let's say I'm looking at this block on the very, very left that contains my transaction. It has two confirmations because there's two more blocks on top that have been mined on top of it. The most recent block will always have 0 confirmations because there's no other block that has been added to it. Does that make any sense? Right? Okay. And so let's look at this scenario. So if I don't wait for any confirmations, this scheme isn't safe. So let's say I wait for k confirmation. So in this example, I'll use k as 2. So what Gloria needs to do to successfully double spend against me is she needs to start her own private chain containing her malicious transaction, and she has to mine 2 more blocks on top of that to overwrite the current history of the blockchain. And then she'll broadcast that secret chain after I send my good, and then that will successfully double spend against me. So this is just an example. So I say, hey Gloria, I'll only send you the iPhone after 2 confirmations after my transaction happens. And so she says, okay. And so she sends Bitcoin to me, and then 2 blocks happen, and then I will send the iPhone. But secretly on her own, she does this thing where she's mining her own private chain. She comes up with 3 different blocks on top of her malicious transaction. And so now she has this fork in the network. And what she can do is she publishes this secret chain to tell everyone in the network, now I have this longest chain, and my transaction in this previous chain gets kind of overwritten. And so Gloria now retains her money, even though I already sent her diphthong. And so she double spent against me. So my question here is, how many confirmations should I wait for to be completely sure my transaction is valid? Anybody have a guess? Yeah, okay, so I have a trick question. It's actually none of these, it's actually 6. And why is that? I'll explain. And so this is just the graph of the probabilities of the success of an attacker to double spend, I guess, against a transaction, a previous transaction. And so if we look at the bottom, this is the probability that the transaction is safe after some k number of confirmations. And so each line represents the computational power an attacker has. So in the case of an attacker having like 10% of the network hash rate, if we wait for 6 confirmations, we can be reasonably sure that our transaction is safe. Same thing around 30. We're not as confident, but we're around 80%, which is a good amount, and we might be able to wait a little longer to be completely sure. But it starts to break down after like when we're close to 50. We see that once we get to 50, we can't wait any number of blocks or any number of confirmations to realize that our transaction is safe because someone has more than 50% of the network. And so the idea here is if Gloria actually contains more than 50% of the total network hash power, she can always catch up to this honest minority and successfully outpace them and double spend with this greater than 50% hash power. Any questions here? And so why would Gloria not want to double spend in this situation? There's a variety of different reasons. If she double spends and everyone finds out, then the confidence in this cryptocurrency kind of decreases or diminishes, and the exchange rate and for the cryptocurrency kind of plummets, and she's left with a bunch of like ASICs that are useless in this useless cryptocurrency, right? What she can do is she can bribe miners to do that that work for her. She might not own all this mining hardware. She might say, hey, I'll pay you some amount of money to try to double spend or something like that. She can bribe miners. And let's say she's a hostile government or a really large adversary who has a lot of capital. She can acquire enough ASICs or bribe enough miners to achieve this 51%. And if her goal is to really like short the currency and destroy confidence in like Bitcoin, she can successfully do so if she gets more than 51% of the network. So I have like a conceptual question here. So if I'm buying a coffee, should I have to wait 6 confirmations, which is like approximately an hour, before I can get my coffee? In this situation, do you really care if you're being double spent on like a $4 coffee? If we look at it from a different perspective, if you're buying a house using Bitcoin, where a large amount of capital is at stake, you might want to wait more than 6 confirmations, or even more confirmations to be sure that your transaction is actually valid or will go through. Does that make any sense? Okay. So we'll talk about censorship in Bitcoin. So we talked about how a lot of like decentralized systems are supposed to be censorship resistant. This is a few situations where we can successfully try to censor someone. So let's say Gloria is a government and she has a lot of control over different mining pools, right? and let's say she has more than 51% of the network's hash power in the situation. This just makes it easier to explain like the naive situation. And so let's say she really hates me, and she wants to censor all of my transactions basically, and prevent me from even interacting with the Bitcoin network. And so we'll denote all our blocks like this. These are blocks mined by Gloria and her like miners, and this is a block containing a transaction made by me. And so my first strategy is to basically, Gloria can say, hey, to like all her miners in her network, she can say, hey, just don't include Brian's transaction in any of your blocks and blacklist me basically. Does this strategy actually work? Anybody have a yes or no kind of a thing? So Gloria can try to blacklist me from participating in the network by telling her all her miners, let's say her 51% of the network, to say, don't include Brian's transaction in any of your blocks. Does this strategy actually work? Yeah. Yes, that's exactly right. So this doesn't work unless you have control over the entire network. If we think about this like this analogy we gave during the mining lecture, where mining power is like how fast you can throw a dart. Even though she has 51% of the network, meaning she can throw her dart pretty fast, the rest of the network can probably get lucky and find a valid block while she's mining really quickly, and a block from this honest minority might get published with my transaction in it. So other miners will eventually include my transaction in their block, and this only causes delays and inconveniences, and it doesn't actually censor me from the entire Bitcoin network. So this naive censorship strategy does not work. So let's take a look at our second strategy. So remember, you're Gloria, you have more than 51% of the network hash rate. What you can do is you can tell so knowing that the other miners in the network might mine a block containing my transaction, you can tell this to the world saying that, hey, once that happens, I'll attempt to fork you. I'll attempt to come up with a longer chain that will overwrite your transaction. So does the strategy work? Yeah, yeah. So that's exactly right. It works. We took a look at this example. If miners include a transaction with my stuff in it, Gloria will start mining her own secret chain and publish that once it's longer than everyone else's. And we know that this will work because if we look back at the last section, if you have more than 51% in the network, you can always outpace the honest minority, basically. And that's the whole key point. So now my transaction will never be published. And so what this eventually leads to is that knowing that their blocks, the honest minority knows that their blocks will never be included anymore, or the blocks containing my transaction will be not included anymore. They can just stop mining my transactions altogether, and eventually the entire network is just completely censoring me. So this is called punitive forking. Any questions? Yeah. So this is in a situation where we're actually abstracting the idea of identity. In reality, if you did have, let's say, if my address is known, I can create a new identity and try to participate in the network that way too. So that's one way around it. But we're abstracting the way of identity in this situation to like look at this from a different perspective. Okay. So let's say let's say Gloria, who is still this like huge mining pool, her half her ASICs like burned down, and she has a decreased number of network hash rate. Um, she can still attempt to fork me and use this method called feather forking to actually successfully censor me too. So the new strategy is Gloria announces that she will attempt to fork if she sees a block from me, but she will give up after a while because she can't. Now that she has less than 51% of the network hash power, she can't reliably outpace the now it's an honest majority. So the example is to give up after like I have 3 blocks ahead of me basically. And so how does this actually work? So this is a little bit of math behind it, but the idea is if we look at Q as our mining power in this network, let's say that's 0.2, the probability of me getting another block on top of it will be Q squared, something like that. And let's say that just like K is just 1 for this example, meaning that I'll give up after another block is found. So the chances of me finding another block on top of Gloria finding another block on top of her own is like 4%. So it's not a very good chance. But the idea is that since we announced that we're going to attempt to fork the network at once my transaction is published, the miners have this idea of they have an expected value of their profits. If they include my transaction, there's a chance that their transaction or their blocks will be invalidated. But if they don't include my transaction, they'll get the full block reward basically. So in this example, they have this like small chance that they won't get the money that they deserve, and so they'll start to not mine my blocks basically, because the probability or the expected value of mining a block containing my transaction has that chance of being invalidated. So as the person being censored, I need to provide a large enough transaction fee to incentivize miners in order to mine my transaction. Yes. I mean, if you have more than 51% of the network, you have like you can reliably outpace the network, so you can always you don't even have to think about feather forking. It becomes the example of punitive forking. This is just saying that, let's say we have less than 51% of the mining power in the network, can we still successfully try to censor someone in the network? And the idea is using feather forking, we can do so. Or we can try to at least, unless if the person who's being censored can pay enough, or offer a large enough transaction fee for mining my transaction, they can still be uncensored, but they have to spend a large amount of capital to do so. That's the gist of feather forking. Yes. Normally you don't, and this is just a general example, but showcasing how feather forking would work in this case. If you have less than 50% of the network, you can still try to censor someone. Yeah. But if you're a rational actor and you notice that, okay, so the whole key like assumption is that Gloria will announce to the world, and everyone has this perfect information where they know that their transaction or their block might have a chance of being invalidated, basically. Yeah. So that's the key assumption in this really general, naive example, basically. Yeah. Any other questions? Okay. Next slide.
Okay. So we're going to talk about selfish mining. Who here knows what selfish mining is? Cool. Not wasting anyone's time except yours. Sorry. Okay. So we need to talk about selfish mining precisely because we have to consider how rational actors act within the Bitcoin ecosystem. That's what we're doing today. So selfish mining is sort of the beginning to a lot of, like, it's the beginning cause to a lot of like game theoretical attacks that we'll talk about later. And so first we have to like pose this question. So exactly what is selfish mining? So suppose you're a miner, you've just found a block, and instead of announcing that block to the network and receiving your reward, you're going to keep it a secret. Can anybody tell me why I would do that? Yeah, go for it. For feather attack, okay. And I know you just learned that, but you want to repeat like what exactly that is. Exactly. So I'm going to like gamble basically that I can hold on to this block and like this is the general premise, like Brian went over, like there are a lot of attacks that come out of this. But the general premise is I'm just going to hold on to my block just because I'm going to bet that my hash power, I have like a better chance of finding the next block. And more specifically, it's called selfish mining or block withholding. But the reason like you'd really want to do this is because if I can create the next block, then I get twice the mining reward. It's not just about double spending at that point. It's I have an advantage over everybody else in the network because if I can find the next block, then I have twice the mining reward. I have an advantage over everybody else who hasn't even seen like block n+1 yet. And so I have all this extra advantage time to mine on this next block and find my longer chain, etc. But it is a gamble. And so if you succeed in finding that second block, you fool the network. Perhaps you can double spend, but the network still believes it's mining on the longest proof of work chain as far as we've defined the blockchain ecosystem like right now. And so if you continue to mine on your own chain, you have that possibility, and I think Brian went over sort of the math of why exactly you would do that. And if the network finds a block, then you run into sort of a problem. You have like this propagation race where now that the network has caught up and they found their own block n+1, well, you've been mining on your block n+1, your secret block, and you've been trying to find the next one, and let's say you didn't make it. Then you want to propagate block n+1 out there as quickly as possible, so that then it becomes a race propagation, a propagation race to see how much of the network will accept your block over the network's block. Yeah, but again, like the main incentive for this is free time mining, just because you have block n+1 before anybody else had that block, and so you have an advantage in how much like computation time you spent. Is that idea clear? Because we're going to go into discussion after this where you're going to try and find ways to prevent this. So this has to be very clear to everybody. No questions? Cool. Okay, yeah, so race to propagate. And then the tricky thing about this is you can, if you have like a certain amount of computational power, you can lose the race every time, and still block withholding is very profitable. You don't even necessarily have to win the next race, but if you do this often enough, you can bet that you're going to win a certain percentage of the time, that it's always worth it for you to do this. That's worrying. That's not what we're trying to incentivize in this blockchain ecosystem, because the way we've defined it now, we'd always take the longest longest chain so far that we've seen, and people can game that system. So we want to prevent that. Okay. Yeah, the actual math for this, if you're interested, you can come talk to us after. Okay, so after that really short just review, we're going to talk a little bit about defense, and we're going to run this a little bit differently. Some people have said that we've been covering too much material during lecture, and so what we're going to try this lecture is breaking up into discussion groups, posing a question, and especially for this, hopefully, you guys can let us know if it doesn't work as well. But I'm going to pose a question, and it's going to be up to you guys and your discussion leads to understand how exactly, propose solutions, discuss about it, and then hopefully you'll be able to understand that better. So if we want to prevent selfish mining, keep in mind all of the things that we're going to talk about today are actual proposals that are out there. They're not all great, but we'd like you to see, using signatures, can you think about how you might be able to prevent selfish mining? And if you need a refresher on what signatures are, ask your discussion TAs, but I'm going to hand it over. Alan, do you want to distribute?
So discussion TAs, can you raise your hand so everyone knows where you are?
If you're not sitting near a discussion TA, can you scooch closer towards a discussion TA clump?
Tim, can you take that first? All right, so Oscar's over there, Justin's over there, and Tim is going to be taking that section right there. And we're just going to be discussing these topics with you guys to see if you guys can figure out a solution for the given problem statement. Sound good?
We want everybody to be really active about this, precisely because it's a lot of material. We recognize that it sinks in better if you talk about it. And I mean, it's hard to find misconceptions unless you talk about it. So please be active. We'll come back in like 5 minutes or like 3 minutes and we'll talk about what the solution is. Yeah.
So,
I know.
all right. How do you guys feel about self-explaining? You guys understand that first? Okay. Yeah, so we should have longer discussion. You sort of have to understand what the problem is, or you can figure out. So, self-explaining, the idea is that your goal is not to propagate the block. Normally, you want to propagate the block to let everyone know about it, and then so everyone can start mining more blocks, and you get your reward. What selfish mining does is that it lets you get a head start on the next block because you already found the current block. So say, an example, Arvin is everyone else and I'm me, right? I found the block, but everyone else is still looking for the next block. Instead of letting everyone else know about the next block, I'm going to keep it to myself, keep that secret, and then I'm going to start mining on that block to get a head start, and then if I can find 2 blocks at a time, I just made it so I already found, I have the longest chain, and even if someone else has found the next block, their chain is going to be rejected because I have 2 blocks ahead of everyone else. Does that sort of make more sense?
Is that why it's 1 minus 2 squared?
Sorry, what was that?
Is that why it's 1 minus 2 squared? Because you have a Q probability of getting the first click. Assuming you have Q percentage of computing power in the system,
Okay.
then like the probability that you find 1 block before everyone else is 2.
Yeah. Yeah.
2 blocks before everyone else finds.
Yeah, so it's like, it makes it so it's almost impossible to have more than like 3 secret blocks, like 3 blocks kept hidden. Unless you have like 100% of the hashing power, it's almost impossible.
If you don't like tell people that you found the first block in the first place, someone else can find these.
Yeah, someone else could, but hear me out. So,
But if they never told the network that they found this block, how can they have a conversation?
because so say we're mining at the same spot. I found it at 5 minutes, right? You found the same, not the same block, but the same block height at 10 minutes. But then at 12 minutes, I say, hey guys, I found the next 2 blocks. Because I have 2 blocks ahead of you, versus you are mining on 1 block, everyone will go to my tree.
And you have, and because of the timestamp that you find
It's not more time frame, just that you have the longest chain.
Why is it malicious for you to publish 2 blocks?
It's not. It's 100% legal. It's just that you don't want to do that because if you keep it selfish to yourself, that means it's not fair for other people. So let me see if I can draw this really quickly. So say we start at this block, right? Right? I'm mining on this block right now, and I already found the block within 5 minutes, right? And at 10 minutes, everyone finds the next block, which is this one. But at 12 minutes, I'm able to find the next one, and I propagate both these blocks at the same time. Everyone that has been working on this and trying to find the next block just wasted all their time because I have the longest chain already. And as a result, people are like, okay, we're not going to continue on this chain to find this block. We're just going to continue on this chain to find the next one for this one.
But they wasted all the resources trying to find.
Yeah, they wasted all the resources using this and that.
How does it help the selfish miner?
They get both these blocks and they wasted all their time. So now you're winning. So pretty much it just makes it so you lower the you have a higher chance of getting all the rewards for yourself while wasting other people's time on their hashing power. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
How much computing power do you need to solve 2 blocks?
It's again like all of
So
it.
then it's not malicious, it's just a way for you to look at it.
Yeah, it's just like a sort of like it's like a loophole. Honestly, it's like how you would consider it's a
But
loophole.
it's legal.
It's legal. That it's part of the Bitcoin. It's not part of the Bitcoin protocol. It's more that the protocol allows this. Which, but your goal isn't to have this because you want to propagate it out, right? Right. So
So okay,
Yeah.
in the reading, it talked about how like if you start selfish mining, then members become incentivized to like honest miners or like the rational miner becomes incentivized to like follow you. I didn't completely understand about that.
Could you repeat the statement? Sorry.
It was like after the reading it says that like if you do selfish mining,
Okay.
then it's called like an economic attack. And then
Your guys' question was about like what it meant
other
for
normal miners are
like why somebody would block the flow. Was that it?
Because they're incentivized to mine more because they don't want to waste time on it. That's the only thing.
That's fair.
Who has it?
If you own like, yeah, okay. Did Alan give like a satisfactory answer?
Wait, what was it?
Oh, the fact that like.
Does everybody have a problem with that? Do you guys understand?
It's
For the most part, do you guys
everyone
understand?
else.
Do you understand?
Well, think about it this way: like, say mining pool is doing this. There's if it's a mining.
Can't hear you.
You can be a person, but like that person can be all connected to one mining pool. You know what I'm saying? Yeah.
Like I couldn't see how it worked.
Yeah. But even then, think about it this way: hashing is all random. You can get it on the first try. You can get it on the 10th try. Like, but normally it's highly unlikely. That's why when you think about it this way, like if you're
Okay.
mining,
So
you can do it by yourself.
the
and
reason it's
eventually
profitable
maybe
long term is
might
because you're making a
get
bet
one,
that
get
you'll
12
be able
Bitcoin,
to
and be
solve,
I'm
like you'll get
rich.
lucky, you have
But
enough
you don't
computational
do
power
that.
that you'll get lucky and be able to solve the next block. And so you can make a calculation in like how much computing power of the network you have and how much time you'd like be the only one working on this puzzle. Does that make sense? Yeah, it doesn't mean that you have more computational power, but it means that there's like you have a competitive edge over other people because while they're still solving a previous block, you've given yourself an edge to work on like the next block up, and you're saying like, okay, let me spend my computational power on this one with the chance that I earn double the block reward, and then I publish both blocks, and then I've like made twice the money. But I only do that like what, like maybe like 25% of the time because I own very little percentage of the network. Does that make sense? And so mining pools might be incentivized to do this, like people with just like large percentages of the network. Does that make sense? Okay.
right, there would definitely be a trade-off.
Yeah.
If you're trying to protect against like selfish mining, I guess one would be to say,
Yep. What about the different people? Do you guys have any idea of that? Yes.
You can't have the same signatures. Like, so does a miner have their own signature? A miner has their own signature, right?
Yeah.
So if a miner can't have two blocks of the same signature, something like that. Yeah. And then if they do, that's like.
Alright, how about this? What about babysitting? How would you prove that you saw it? With signatures.
Yeah. Like,
How would you distinguish it to prove it?
so then like you have to prove validity on blocks.
sort of like, it's like this miner solved this block,
Yeah.
and then they can't solve the next block.
Is that everyone's
Yeah. Sort of like not everybody put much.
you require multiple signatures on a block essentially.
Yeah.
So that you can't, so that if you're n plus one chain, it's you sign the first block, you sign the second block, but the other person published it, that has multiple signatures that clearly propagated as soon as it was created. For example, kind of signify, hey, you've been working on your own chain and using the selfish mining tag.
Yeah. So pretty much like the idea about it, like in simple terms, we're gonna discuss it in a second in more detail, but like when you propagate it out, everyone signs it to say that they have seen it. So then when you try to send that to them, there's no signature on that block to say that you signed it. So then you're like, this is all this is
Okay. Guys, let's come back. Let's come back really quickly. So no matter on how far your discussion group got, a question I got that I feel like is pretty important and we should talk about. Does everybody understand why anybody would withhold a block? Is that clear? So if you have any questions, it's difficult to talk about it. Can someone explain to me why? Not this group. Can someone explain why? Can someone explain why I would block a poll? Okay. And so, but how do I have more computational power? Do I suddenly have more computational power? because I'm mining on my own chain. Yeah. I have a time advantage. And what does that give me? Besides the time advantage. Like, with the time advantage, what can I do? What does that enable me to do? Right. So if I have a certain amount of computational power on the network, like say a mining pool, they have like a significant percentage of the mining of the computational hash rate. Even a certain amount of time advantage gives me this ability to make a calculative opportunity cost, where I can make a gamble and say I can calculate what the probability is that I'll be able to solve the puzzle, and even if I solve the puzzle, like solve this next block only like maybe 10% of the time, over time that's an expected profit, and I'm wasting everybody else's time on the other chain because I'm able 10% of the time I'm able to get double the block reward. That makes it worth it. Does that make sense? Okay. Did that clarify things for people? All right. Okay. So let's talk about. Let's go back to the problem. So did anybody have a brilliant solution to this using signatures? Did your discussion TAs give away the answer? No? Yes? I don't know. Okay, does anybody have any ideas? Any brilliant discussion points? You're all stuck? No one came out with anything? What's a signature? No one knows what a signature is either? Discussion TAs, what did you do? Okay, can someone give me something? Anything about this? Go for it.
Signature is basically like a validation to like approve like I see this block and approve my signature.
Yeah, okay, so it's a validation that I can sign off on something. It's what it is in real life too. How do we use signatures for this? Any ideas? Why would we need to sign off on anything? These aren't meant to be rhetorical questions. Yeah, go for it. Oh, did you have something to say? Go for it.
To ensure, yeah, so signing off on a block being propagated to
Yeah.
ensure that it's not being mined by on its own chain selfishly.
Yeah, so that is exactly the proposition. This came out in like most recent version in 2016. As you might imagine, it's not like a terribly revolutionary idea to sign off on things that you've seen. Accompanying like every block that comes out needs to be accompanied with a dummy block that has signatures that say people on the network have seen this block, and you can prove to people who are looking at the block that yeah, okay, it's been approved by other people on the network, so it didn't just like it wasn't just from you. Does that make sense? Why they proposed this? Any questions about this? Yeah. What exactly? Exactly. So what if it's a mining pool? And what if, even more than that, like, this isn't Sybil attack resistant, right? What's stopping me from creating a whole bunch of dummy nodes and just approving my own block and making it look like I built this dummy block by propagating it to the network? There's really no way to know that. So this isn't a great proposition, and that's why it's only a proposition. Precisely because it was proposed, it's sort of a naive solution, but it's not like it has a whole bunch of problems with it. Does anybody else think of, can anybody else think of a potential problem? Yeah. Yeah. Go for it. Oh, a different solution? Okay, what's your different solution? Timestamps. All right. So we'll talk about that. Cool. All right. So no questions about this? All right. So again, the problem with dummy blocks, it doesn't provide a mechanism to evaluate, like, how do you know how many proofs is enough? And how do you know that you haven't had Sybil attacks? How do you know that you haven't had just like your entire mining pool get together and sign off on blocks and all earn more block rewards? And furthermore, this requires sort of fundamental changes to how you validate a block, which is never what we want. We want to make as minimal changes to the past as possible so that as we move forward, we can do soft forks, stuff like that. Everyone understand these problems? Okay, sounds good. So let's try and solve it again, this time with block rewards. Everyone understand what a block reward is? When I create a block, I get a reward. Pretty self-explanatory. All right, discussion groups, go. We'll talk for another like 5 minutes.
Did that answer the question for us? All right, cool. All right. Oh yeah. So once I can talk about that, what do you think? With any type of proposal, what is the biggest area? because you had it's pretty much what you just said. Like, any type of protocol or like solution you try to do, you're gonna be completely manipulating the whole protocol of Bitcoin, which I think with Bitcoin Cash, you're gonna be hard forcing anything you ever want to do unless everyone agrees on it. So with any solution, you're gonna one of the issues that all of them have is that if not everyone agrees on this, you're gonna create a hard fork, and it's not the best thing you do at times when you do that. So back to this question: what do you guys think about block rewards? Like, what do you think is the biggest issue when you're doing selfish mining? Yeah. So what are you doing when you propagate all that out? What are you creating? Okay. So say I'm hiding this, right, and then now I've released it. What have I just created right here? Wait. Yeah.
Like people should, like negative externalities.
Yeah. But like, what has been created? Sort of what I just said. Yeah, a fork. So that's the biggest issue that's happening when you're propagating a secret block out. You're creating a fork, right? And the system itself doesn't really have the best way of dealing with this situation. The solution we have right now is that pick the one with the longest chain, right? That's helps sometimes, but it promotes selfish mining, right? So what do you think we can do to prevent people from forking the system then?
You provide a same reward for the
Did I get
regardless of the length.
same reward for both person?
Just for publishers.
Oh, okay. So you're saying that even if I publish 2 blocks, I only get one reward for that. So like 12.5 Bitcoin. Okay. That actually could work. I can see that working. But let's see. What if they legitimately just found 2 chains at once? Like again, because think about it this way: if you have a huge mining pool of like 40%, you can easily sometimes do this legitimately. So now you're getting punished for something you did legitimately. Yeah.
If you're an honest miner, you propagate the first one first, you'll receive your block reward, then you'll propagate the second. It's only the selfish miner that's going to try to propagate both at once.
That's true.
I mean, I'm sure there are getting theoretical problems wrong with this
Yeah.
that I haven't thought of, but I think it's like if you're an honest miner, there will be a time limit. It can be small.
How about this then? What if 2 people just happen to mine a block at the same time, right? So we happen to just get 2 blocks created at the same time, and they both somehow manage to exactly propagate to 50% of the people. Each one is 50%. So now you have 2 blocks, right? Half these people don't know that you have this block, and half these people don't know you have this block. And for some reason, you're able to. And then once you create the next block, right? You have to propagate this out to everyone else, like because this was only for 50% of the group, right? This originally was 50%, and this was originally 50%. And this is a legitimate scenario where both of them were mined at the same time, and you just happen to manage to propagate that out both 50% of the network and 50% of the other network. You're not punishing this whole other side for doing something legitimate. So again, this is like all our solutions that we present today are not perfect. So this is definitely an idea that can be fleshed out and could work. But again, like this could be an issue as well. But
Mine was less big so you got some equity.
but like, what if it's a mining pool? Like some people are poor there, you know. Like I want a mining pool myself. Like I only got like half Bitcoin at home. Now I'm getting punished for it. Yeah, but pretty much, you guys sort of hit the idea that you want to just make it so whoever forks it only get maybe one block reward. What if they just don't get any block reward? Who do you think should not get any block reward if you were forking? The selfish miner? But then, which one would you mine on then? Because the selfish miner has the longer chain. What do you think? We can punish the selfish miner, but like, what do we do after? Or should we punish them both? Just saying this next solution is a solution, but I really don't like it.
I mean, it's like if someone's talking to you, you get to see both of you get information.
I mean, that's how school works.
Yeah, that's a terrible policy.
Okay, let's bring it back.
You guys don't have this good idea.
Okay. Guys. Okay. So, someone want to tell me what their discussion group talked about? You can claim it as your own idea. Yeah. No, you're not raising your hand. Never mind. Anybody? No groups came up with an idea? Go for it.
So you can do a diminished reward or for a chain, longer chain, you only get one reward.
Okay.
Punish the selfish man.
Yeah, okay. Who else thought of that? A diminished reward. Or changing how, what was the last bit?
Just to punish the.
Punishing the selfish mind. Okay. Anybody else come up with that? Okay. What did your group say?
So it said that if it was working and working, then there would be no reward.
Okay. No reward at all. Okay. And so how does this fix the problem? Does somebody else want to explain? Brian. Okay.
So the inherent bad behavior that we're trying to fix is fork, because selfish mining attempts to fork the honest chain and overwrite their valid and good work. And so the behavior that we're trying to change or fix is the idea of we don't want that.
Did everyone hear that? Does everyone agree with that statement? Besides the fact that Brian said it. The thing we're trying to fix is forking, because one way to formulate the problem is that the selfish miner is incentivized to fork onto their own chain and continue building on their own chain. In order to start your own chain, you have to fork. And so we'd like to discourage that behavior. This is shifting the problem onto how do we use block rewards to disincentivize forking. And so we got two solutions where you just don't reward for those forks, and you either penalize or something like that. You have a diminished reward. So that is basically what the proposition is. Again, they're not all super brilliant. So, not to say you guys aren't brilliant. Never mind. But competing blocks receive no block reward. So the basic idea is we don't provide any sort of block reward, and then we provide half a block reward to the first miner who incorporates a proof for that block fork. And so if I'm a miner and somebody else has published their secret chain because it just worked out like that, they finally published their secret chain. If I'm the first miner to show that there was a fork and I include that into my block, then I get half the block reward, and it's not necessarily the selfish miner. Does that make sense? Yeah.
How do you prove fork?
Proof of fork? That's up to implementation, but how exactly you want to just put that into a block, you just have to include something in that block that says, at this point in time, there was this fork in history, and if your block gets accepted and propagated, then you get half the block reward. You can include that to yourself. Does this make sense? Yeah. Yeah, so this isn't great, right? Because there's some collateral damage there. We've basically disincentivized forking at all, which is not a good idea because forks happen naturally, especially with honest blocks. And so again, this isn't perfect. Does anybody else have any problems with this? Yeah.
So I still don't see, can't the person who withheld the block still benefit from the block?
Okay. Does anybody want to respond to that question? The question was, can't the person who created the block, who is selfish mining, still benefit from the block reward? Yeah. Anybody have an answer? You guys are all looking at the same slide. I think it says it on there. Yes?
Yes, if the miner thinks ahead and okay, this is at this time, maybe a fork there and sees already complete the bears proof of fork.
Does anybody take issue with this?
You just make the block you get a whole block reward, but it stays in the half.
And why is that?
Also, one way that the selfish miner can actually include a proof of work, because if you want to base the proof of work based off of the two blocks that are being forked, but the two blocks that have forked,
selfish miner won't know the honest block ahead of time, and so he can't include this proof of work initially. So he has to like that's one of the reasons why proof of work is there too. It's based off of the two hashes of the blocks.
Did everyone hear that? That's pretty important.
So when you're including a proof of work, it has to be based off the two blocks at the fork. And if a selfish miner knows that he's going to fork the network to have a secret chain, he can't include a proof of work containing a block that he doesn't know will fork or that will be the honest block at that particular point in time, because that block hasn't existed.
Does that make sense? So when we say that the proof of work is an implementation detail, one rather important implementation detail is to make sure that your proof of work includes the two branched forks, the blocks that are involved in that two branched forks, because that means that whatever you're building upon, it's been seen in the network. Both branched blocks have been seen in the network, and you're not just secretly building on your own chain. Good question.
Web selfish miner couldn't have any amount of mining power trying to mine an honest chain as well, and then incorporate that to the proof of work back in the selfish miner.
I'm not entirely sure I understand the question.
So I guess you said it couldn't be a proof of work from the selfish miner because the selfish miner doesn't.
So my answer to you is if he's working in the honest in the honest chain also, he's not working on his own private chain. So it also contradicts his own work that he does.
Because you have basically a node or a very small amount of mining power. Say if you're doing selfish mining with 40% and you put 0.1% on the other chain, just so you'll have this ability to find proof of work.
But the thing is, you're basically competing against yourself, and that doesn't actually make any sense too. Like if your 0.1 in the mining pool finds a value block at that point, you're trying to overwrite yourself, right?
Like it's possible, but like it's not a great opportunity cost just because the rest of the network is likely going to beat you to a valid block. In that case, if you're only allocating like 0.1% of your computing power to find the regular networks block, again, like it's unlikely that you'll find it, and B, it's more likely that the rest of the network will move on without you. Does that make sense? Okay, but it is possible. Yeah.
Or his point was that like once you found like the hash or whatever like solves, then you could just like pretend to be another node, and then you can like fork it, and then you know at what time that node will fork it, and then you have both of the block blocks.
Okay, I'm gonna keep going, but we should talk about this continuously. Okay. All right, so to go over the drawbacks. So again, like we said earlier, honest miners will suffer collateral damage, and this leads to more attacks that we won't go into. And again, this requires fundamental changes to the reward distribution rules. Again, that's like a fundamental protocol level change. We don't want to do those because those are hard forks. And so we'd like to know if we can do better. And so to answer whether or not we can do better, we have to recognize that this becomes a way to punish anyone who created the block before the fork. Does that make sense? Does that sentence make sense? Okay. And to answer whether or not we can do better, we have to think more about sort of existing solutions and the environment that our problem is posed upon. This is pretty theoretical so far. We need to think about sort of the Bitcoin network as it exists today. And so in the past, we've talked about how mining pools have like sort of centralized the ecosystem, how you have one node and it can be connected to a lot of different nodes. So when we say P2P, just to define some terms, P2P, gossip protocol, 8 outbound connections. These are, you don't really have to know about this, but P2P just means like peer-to-peer, and what we mean by that is whoever's on the network, you talk to other nodes on the network, rather than a system where you would talk to one central node. And the Bitcoin network, blockchain networks in general, are peer-to-peer. And so to understand how information propagates across this network, we need to think about the topology of the network latency, how long it takes information to travel from one end to the other end. This is really important because block propagation defines our version of truth. And so if you have one node that's a lot more influential than others, if you're that one node and you propagate your block well, you have an enormous advantage because more of the network sees that one node, one block, a lot faster. Does everyone understand why this problem exists? Okay. And furthermore, it's difficult to distinguish the network topology. What that means is we don't really have an overhead view of what the Bitcoin network looks like today. We don't really know which nodes are connected to which nodes are pinging which nodes for information. We don't really know how they're connected. And so that makes it really difficult to understand how safe our Bitcoin network today is. So this is another sort of problem that people have written a whole bunch of proposals for. So for instance, if Derek, Rusty, Gloria, Nick, Nadir, if Derek was connected to a whole bunch of miners, then he has more computing power than everybody else on this network. And so the Bitcoin network, we say, is safe as long as greater than 50% of the network is safe. And we talked about this in a previous lecture where we have to incentivize, align those incentives, make sure that people are wanting to act safely, wanting to act in accordance with the way we'd like them to act. And we talked about selfish mining. The problem being that with decreasing amounts of computational power, we said earlier that it becomes profitable for people to selfish mine, even with low amounts of computational power, because they're making that trade-off where they say, yo, like, I'm going to bet that I will win 10% of the time, and that's enough for me because the block reward is really high. And so that really points us to understanding the network topology again, understanding, do we have nodes that are way more influential than others? And if so, what do we do about it? So to focus on the propagation times problem, the idea is basically you want to get data out to the network as quickly as possible, as we know. If you found a valid block, an honest miner who's not selfish mining is going to send that block out to all of their related nodes as quickly as possible because they want the whole network to accept their block as the new valid block. That's the only way they get their block reward. So they're incentivized to send it out as quickly as possible. This leads to block propagation races, where if you have one node that is much more influential than another node and they both send out blocks at the same time, one has a clear advantage, and that leads to disproportionate profits, which again is not ideal in our ecosystem. In a decentralized ecosystem, we have to keep in mind that we need to control for these sort of things. And so another way you can think of an attack happening here, and why it's important to know network topology, is that you can flood the network with zero power nodes. Again, this is the idea of a Sybil attack. So if Derek secretly is monitoring how each of the other nodes is getting their information, then Derek has a very clear advantage where how is Nadir supposed to know that Derek has, how is Nadir supposed to know that Derek, who's hiding behind all of these pseudonymous public addresses, is actually the same person, and they're always going to censor whatever block that might have come in, and they're always going to send Nadir Derek's block. So we really have no idea in an anonymous system. And so again, today is the day we destroy Bitcoin, right? These are all the problems that exist, and we need to find ways to work around it. Everyone understand this problem? Yeah? Okay. Yeah, so if Derek has block X, and Derek hears about block X, he's going to propagate block P, because that's Derek's block, and he's just going to overwhelm the network with his own block as much as he can. Okay, so let's return to the question. How do we prevent selfish mining when the problem is that we reward the longest chain? This is just how we do it so far, right? We reward the longest chain. So given that we talked about network topology, let's have a discussion on how we can prevent selfish mining in this situation. Discuss. And you had a question. Discussion, please. Commence.
Give me half a second. Let me keep the slides. Alright, so. Alright, cool. So, what do you, I think you guys have some ideas. What do you guys think? How can we stop? How can we stop selfish mining? Not a solution, but stop people from trying to do selfish mining in general. What do you guys think? How about we give you a different claim? Random. What can, What can you do to make it maybe more random and maybe more fair so people don't want selfish money? Any idea? Yes. So it's sort of like a race. Like think about a race. It's a terrible idea to do this, but like say if I was racing you, like just a running race, right? If we both somehow manage to be at the same time to finish the finish line, you might as well just like save some time, just flip a coin and say whoever gets it right gets it right. So like the idea about this is that we want to sort of make it more random. You guys think if you have an idea to make it more random, like say someone just try to propagate the longest chain. How would randomization prevent selfish mining and prevent that person from doing selfish mining in the future? What do you guys think? Does that make sense? Sorry. Yeah. Tell me more. Yeah. So essentially, that's the idea. So what your goal is to do. Yeah. So what he said is that if two blocks are so it's a selfish mining. If someone's trying to keep a secret block from you, right, and they manage to get 2 blocks now mined, so they want to like upkeep both of those blocks out now and get like hella money, right?
Wait, if they get 2 blocks ahead, right? Then they want to keep mining that because they can wait for a block to propagate and then propagate it.
Well, think about it this way. Okay. Let me try to like see if I can explain. So, say you have 2 blocks, right? You found the second block, and yes, and everyone else on the network is currently mining on a different block, and they're about to hit n+2. You want to propagate that out as best you can because you can't compete with everyone, the entire network, correct? You don't have enough hashing power. So you're going to propagate it out at sort of an ideal time, hopefully like right after you get your second block.
As soon as someone publishes n+1, you have not found your n+1, you're going to publish n+1, n+2, because you don't want to risk
Yeah,
anyone else.
that's ideal. But if you're able to actually get to n+3, that's like ideal. Like you want to keep going, right? But it's really hard because you're competing with the entire network. So let's see. What were we talking about? So pretty much the idea about randomness is that say you have you have these 2 chains, right? What's the point of me doing all these extra work and trying to keep a secret block and everything if we're just gonna pick a chain randomly, right? You guys sort of see like I wouldn't want to selfish mine. I'll just do regular mining because it's just more feasible and I wouldn't waste more hashing power because hashing power isn't free. Don't forget about that. Yeah.
So does this mean that regardless of how deviating, like, me having a one extra block, it might randomly choose someone else?
Yes.
Does that defeat the purpose
Of what?
I'm kind of double slaying, and then I'm like being on the list to change someone, and then my chain is shorter than everyone else's because I have less computing power.
Yeah.
So then I just randomly get selected.
Yeah, so that's a reason why this doesn't work because, again, like what you just said, I mean, think about it this way, even if you had a malicious block, most of the network could tell that it is a malicious block and won't even accept it in general. But if you think about it, if they somehow weren't able to manage to see that, right? You're right now, any time there's a fork, it's always going to be random. Do you think that's good or not? It's like,
No, like to my understanding, the whole like thing about blockchain security is that since you take the longest chain as like God, since you take the longest chain as like the truth, then if you like stop taking the longest chain as truth like deterministically, then when you start randomly choosing shorter chains, then what's the point of having a greater
that block isn't really guaranteed because you still need like I think they should do a they need 6 confirmations after that block is legitimate and immutable, right? So even if you did pick the shorter chain, if it's only by 1 or 2 blocks, it doesn't really guarantee that there is going to be one. you guys understand how randomness could be used to just sort of decentralize people from wasting their time trying to keep everything secret, trying to like idealize perfectly with like efficient math, statistics, other stuff. Just try to get that so they can get some extra time. You guys sort of understand that? Alright.
Okay. Can't tell how done.
Okay, we can talk. We can talk. Anyone got questions first of all? Let's go with that. Yeah. No. So the way this protocol would work would be like, oh shit, there's a fork. Let's just randomly pick one. Because if we pick the one we want, we'll always support self mining in the past. But if we pick the shorter one, now that person has this self mining, it's completely wasted his time and energy. So as a result, when there's a fork that happens, we randomly pick it and then just follow that path. Say that again, sorry. Rewarding. So,
Okay, guys, let's come back. Let's come back and talk about why exactly this claim can be fixed. The problem, again, is that we reward the longest chain. Anybody have suggestions? Nobody has. You guys are all talking about good things. All right. So, another way to frame this problem is that we currently choose the longest chain whenever we're faced with a tie. Whenever we're faced with a problem, we'll pick the one with the longer chain. And so, as you guys read this, while you're reading this, let me just go ahead and mention. So, this guy, Sire, I don't know how to say that, but Sire, and the other guy, the way they posed this problem was basically anyone with network dominance is going to get their block out there faster. And so if you have an uneven network topology, you have two miners who release their blocks at the same time. The only way to prevent that sort of unevenness and make sure that if as you're receiving blocks, you treat these two fairly, is to have like an interval of waiting time. Whereas a verifier, as a confirmer, you sit there and you wait for like, say 5 seconds, and any blocks that come into your mailbox in those 5 seconds, you're going to treat them all equally, and you're going to pick randomly from those 5. Does this make sense? Does this sort of relate to what you guys were talking about? I heard randomness a lot. Yeah, okay. What are some problems with this? Anybody want to propose something? Increased latency. What does that mean? Yeah, okay. So now you're waiting even more time for your blocks to get confirmed. Any other questions? Any other problems with this?
Different blocks will have different results because.
Okay. What do you mean by that?
So one block may say I pick A, the other one may say I pick B. So how do you reach consensus?
So consensus, does anybody want to respond to that? So the way we think about consensus right now is whatever the majority of the network accepts that we consider our next truth. So if everyone on the network is picking randomly, well, they do pick a block. So eventually we will have some sort of consensus. It might not be, like it'll be 50-50 sometimes, like then you have to deal with that as a different case, but it's very unlikely that it's exactly 50-50%. And so one will win out by like a tiny edge. And in this way you control for, it's not perfect, but this is one way to control for how quickly a block propagates across the network. Does that make sense to everybody? So one other way, I heard somebody say timestamps earlier. Who was the person who said timestamps? Okay, cool. What was your idea for timestamps?
So basically, you can wait for different
Yeah, that's a good idea. So that's actually not what they proposed, not exactly. But in 2014, this guy said, oh, that shouldn't say unforgettable, that's unforgeable. Meaning like you can't forge the timestamp. Okay, so each miner incorporates the latest unforgeable timestamp issued by a central trusted party into the working block and saying like this is when I published it, and let me send it out to everybody. And so when, as a miner, in order to create that block, you have to include that timestamp. And so when you send out your public, your secret chain, people are going to look at it and say, well, your block is staler than the other blocks that were just mined and just propagated. Does this premise make sense to people? Any questions? Yeah, go. Yeah, so that can mean a lot of things. In this case, the guy who wrote it meant a centralized third party, like a centralized third party that is trusted to be putting out timestamps. Exactly, that's the problem with this. The problem is that now we've moved towards centralization again. Okay, any other questions with this? So as you can see, a lot of the propositions aren't fantastic, but they do illustrate some basic problems that people have with the Bitcoin network, and we're not done. Yeah, so drawbacks. Tie-breaking rules don't apply when the selfish mining chain is just longer. So if the selfish mining chain is already longer, none of this controls for any of that. We basically haven't solved the selfish mining problem. We've only solved the network propagation problem. And if the attacker has a large amount of computational power, then these defenses don't do anything precisely for, like if they're solving blocks significantly faster than everyone else on the network, waiting an interval of time doesn't change anything. They get their block out there way faster. Does that make sense? Including your last timestamp also doesn't really change things because they just mined a faster block and they just publish that. The timestamp one is really dependent on the fact that if you have a small portion of the computation power, when you are forced to publish your blocks, sometimes they'll be stale. But in this case, if you have a large percentage of the computational power, we don't defend against that with these two. Does that make sense to people? Okay. If you have more questions, bring it up with your discussion TAs. Okay. Yeah, and then the last one being that a centralized third party is exactly the opposite of what we're aiming for. Okay. So this is the login code. Make sure to do this, and then we're not quite done because we have one more discussion question. But that one, your discussion TAs are going to explain the solution. At this point, we're transitioning directly into discussion. If you guys liked this format and you'd like us to do this more often and you feel like you took more away from the class when we do it this way, do let us know, like talk to your TAs, let them know. Okay, I'm just gonna leave this up for like 2 minutes and then we'll go on to the next question.